And now we are here. So we've had these great presentations. Thank you so much, Ana. Thank you so much, Alex, for really setting the stage for what we're going to talk about. Of course, our remarks have focused quite a bit on just disinformation. But one of the key things to understand is that disinformation does not exist in a vacuum. Disinformation is one of the tools that exist in terms of influence operations. And influence operations are what make so that disinformation actually sticks. Disinformation is actually effective. And I think, thinking about, why a news story about someone who's very corrupt in a country where corruption is everywhere sticks is because it matches part of their reality, right? And so I think this discussion, we're really going to focus on unpacking that toolkit, thinking about the different tools that are used to destabilize the political discourse and how that can be effective around elections. I think that the best way to start will probably be to kick it over to Ambassador Dan Fried. If you could give us an overview just generally of, what are influence operations? What do bad actors do? And then we will split it up with our experts to talk deeper dive.
It isn't new. In the old days, my days, the Soviet Union started the rumor that the CIA had invented AIDS. And the way it planted the story was to go to pliable African newspapers, get the story planted, and then encourage left-wing newspapers in Europe, fringe newspapers, to pick it up. And by degrees, move the story from the geographic fringes of the mainstream media to the political fringes to the political mainstream by degrees. And it worked. The rumor was picked up. It remained folklore for years and years. CIA invented AIDS. This took a number of weeks to months to put into place. And the Soviet propaganda apparatus and the KGB, which was running the operation, relied on, in Europe at least, the category of people called useful idiots and fellow travelers, various witting, semi-witting or unwitting agents. Now, of course, thanks to the internet, the process doesn't take weeks, it takes hours, sometimes minutes, and instead of actually relying on human beings to disseminate the story to favorable or well-inclined newspapers, you can have sites set up in the thousands, or bots, or various impersonator accounts, flogging your story and moving it into the mainstream very quickly. Mr. Alaphilippe was right when he pointed out that the printing press created not only the Gutenberg Bible, but all kinds of religious tracts that helped spark the religious wars. And propaganda using the technologies of the time is as old as the technology of the time. The United States, 1790s, scurrilous pamphlets making all kinds of claims, Adams about Jefferson, Jefferson about Adams. This stuff goes on through the 19th century. The cheap daily newspaper, the radio, the television, every advance of technology can be and has been subverted for propagandistic purposes. So there is nothing conceptually new about propaganda on the internet except that it's awfully fast and it is awfully hard to fight the way all new technologies are seen as hard to fight, which gets us into the area of solutions, but that's the next topic. My point, though, is that this is not new. We have dealt with this before, and it is useful to take a step back and look at the solutions through which democratic and even non-democratic societies have developed and then applied norms of behavior to integrate new information technology without succumbing to the worst features of that technology.
Ambassador Fried, you mentioned useful idiots, fake idiots. And I think this is a great opportunity to bring David Alandete, who knows very well about useful idiots and fake idiots that have, decided to take up quite a few stories and amplify that which is false. If you could just, get us started on that.
I know a little bit about them.
A little.
So the thing is that I completely agree with you, Ambassador, and I think the problem today is that when you compete online, the ground is leveled, and journalists have to compete with people who act like they are journalists, but they are not. So I'm a journalist. I've always been a journalist, and I believe that what we do is just like we actually are exercising a right that belongs to the whole of society. Society has to be, in order to make good choices and make good decisions, we need information. You vote for this candidate or the other one. You know what to do. You know if you have to protest or not. But this information kills the journalist and tries to bypass the press in order to make it easy for politicians or like authoritarian regimes to actually talk to the people directly. So you were talking about these little campaigns that we suffer as journalists, the attacks towards journalists. I've been accused of being an agent of the CIA. Now I'm supposed to work for NATO. I've got money from George Soros just because, I've been trying to report on disinformation here in Europe. And first in the Catalan crisis, now with the far-right parties, with the Italian referendum. And we have to suffer a lot of people who actually play the role willingly. How did, just to summarize, how did they come to the topic of disinformation and what a great challenge it's for democracy nowadays? Actually, it was not here in Spain. I was a correspondent in the Middle East. I worked for a Spanish newspaper there. And when I had the chance to go to Syria, I had the chance to see how Russian public media portrayed the conflict and portrayed the United States and portrayed NATO. The United States was going to start a war in Syria just because they wanted some type of gas or oil or something. NATO was corrupt and was trying to find ways. This is all portrayed there. Chemical attacks didn't exist. The regime supported by Russia was actually defending democracy against all odds. And this type of little bubble that was created there was later slowly expanded into other areas of attack. Now we face an environment in which, the Russian public media operate in Spanish, in French, in Arabic. It's a major problem, in Chinese, in any language that you may imagine. And they are portraying an alternative and different reality. That's what they claim, we portray a different reality. And to actually address your point, when they come here, they find people who are willing and ready to believe what they are portraying. We've all, I'm sure you've heard about it, even if you live in the United States. There were 1,000 people injured in the referendum in Catalonia. We've seen those images right now. Were there 1,000 people injured? They were not. This was in the front pages of many, many newspapers. There were a lot of people who were willing and ready to believe this because there were people here who were actually saying this. And then, the problem is, when you don't have a strong media who actually takes on the challenge of verifying facts and, doing our job, then, I think everything fails and you have this current dystopian situation in which, anything is possible in Europe, far right, far left, and the middle of the ground is lost.
So much to unpack there, particularly thinking about journalists verifying facts in an era where everything is about being first, being the breaking news, being viral. That is what the business model is designed for. But before I deep dive into that, I want to talk a little bit more. Nico, we know each other for quite a bit. You contributed to the Kremlin's Trojan Horses report series for the Atlantic Council at a time where folks were not paying attention to the challenge of Kremlin, particularly as it targeted Spain. You're an expert on hybrid warfare. If we talk about, we've been talking about how the far right and far left are starting to communicate beyond just their own communities and their own networks in their countries. Help us unpack a little bit about how dark money and disinformation and political networks across domestic actors actually, is operating right now and the threat behind that.
Okay. It's also a difficult question.
Yeah, solve the problem.
Yeah, it's such a question. Well, the point is that for those of us who were following Russia since many years ago, it was more easy probably to see this coming, because several years ago, it was clear that they made a decision that they need to undermine the West and undermine us in order to protect themselves. This is always in a problem of wrong perception in the Kremlin, but which is real. I mean, they really think that there is a plan from the West to destroy Russia, actually. So that's why they interpret all their moves as defensive moves. They always think that they are defending themselves. In Ukraine, in Syria, whatever. They always think that, and everything is part of a plan. That's their perception. So if David is publishing whatever news, then it's part of the plan, because either Soros or the CIA or whatever, it's behind that thing. And what the Kremlin is doing is basically to offer a platform to multiply this effect of our own crisis. Because here we have three dimensions. One is that the one that has been referred by Ana de Palacio, this deeper crisis of the West, of our liberal democracies, which is not exactly coming from 2008, but definitely since then we are still struggling with this, and the lack of prosperity, or the apparent lack of prosperity, and the crisis of legitimacy of our systems. Then we have, related to this, the crisis of the traditional media. The business model is not clear. This is what David was referring to. And also this is connected to digitalization of the world. So all this combined, this is a pretty serious challenge. And it's not only Russia doing this, of course. Private actors, state actors, and many others, and the media standards are not necessarily the best everywhere. I'm coming from Barcelona, and we have some local channels which are not that different from Russia Today, I have to say. And sorry, now for a moment I'm lost. But I also enjoy this analogy with the war on drugs. Yeah, so we have this problem. This will be So this will be connected to the demand. Yeah, this wide crisis that we have to approach related to education, media literacy, all these kind of approaches that are part of the solution. But then we have the suppliers, and I know a bit about this. One of the main suppliers, Ambassador Fried was referring, as Russia has been doing this for a long time. And they identify rightly that the question of the legitimacy of the West, which is now under pressure, is an element to exploit. But because what they are doing is to exploit vulnerabilities, and we have many vulnerabilities. And the problem is that we have to decide whether we approach all this all together at the same time, which is going to be difficult because we cannot solve all these vulnerabilities from one day to another, or if we focus on at least to prevent these hostile foreign actors to take advantage of this situation. But this is easily said and is difficult to tackle, because they are basically taking advantage of our free flow of information and freedom of speech. And how to apply legislation to deal with this problem is particularly difficult. At least something that needs to be done, and that's what me and others are trying to do, which is not really easy, is to connect all dots. Because as you have said in the beginning, disinformation is not taking place within a vacuum. And when we refer to the Kremlin, this is part of a big framework. And that connects from nuclear intimidation, military means, to the use of dirty money, to disinformation, and to many other intelligence services, of course, and to many other things. It doesn't mean that there is a clear, detailed plan in place, but there is clearly a strategic or coherent strategy behind all these moves. So we can connect all these dots. And, of course, you can advance your strategic goals funding specific political parties within Europe. So probably we need to adapt our legislations to this problem. So far we know about the Front National, which is now called Regroupement National, if I'm correct. Since a few days back we heard about the Lega in Italy. And these are probably just the tip of the iceberg. So there's much more there. And we can see also a pattern, also in the kind of factors they're approaching in far right and far left. And I finish with this. Alexander was referring to the yellow vest. It's quite interesting. The positive coverage that almost all Russian media, not only those owned by the state directly, are giving to the yellow vest as the representatives of the genuine French people against the elite, globalist, this kind of hidden government or whatever. So this is what they are offering. They think they are defending themselves, but undermining us.
Yeah. I mean, I think when we talk about vulnerabilities, right, I think we ought to make sure that we do separate levels. We have our societal vulnerabilities, and then we have the vulnerabilities to our critical infrastructure, which is where I really want to talk to Kadri and really bring her into this. A lot of the political discourse, or when we think about democratic institutions, when we think about voting, when we think about elections, we think about protecting our ballot system and cyber. But the truth is that there's different elements within cyber that can easily disrupt and affect the way that we see, candidates, the way that we see even our own environment, right? There's the narrative that the Kremlin pushes a lot is the decay of the West, right? Like, you can't walk out, like if you go to Copenhagen, they will take your kids kind of narrative, right? And so it would be great if you could just unpack a little bit on the critical infrastructure, the vulnerabilities, and how we can start thinking about that. No easy task. I have no easy questions.
It's funny. I normally get those questions from the other point or from the other perspective in particular. So describe to me how is this not a technical issue? And you come from exactly the opposite angle. And because I've had, and we, and not least in Estonia, we've had to preach quite a bit that election security is not simply about securing the information systems or vote tallying and voting systems, but it's about securing our increasingly digital societies, and we are very often fixated on the sort of the technical issues. We are in general. We are rather good at understanding elections in the context of overall constitutional and political processes of a country. But as soon as we began discussing elections, cybersecurity, people become very quickly somehow myopic around the issue, around technology, around technological or technical issues. So I think we need to zoom out from there again. For one, the issue is not primarily about elections as such. It is about the resilience of our digital ecosystems and very much about the resilience of our normal habitual functioning of societies. So elections are simply an element in that. Not unique, not different, just special because of their constitutional and political significance. And in terms of threat picture or cyber threat picture, what we've seen over the past 5 years, I would say now, is that disinformation and attacks against election processes exploit and are amplified by our inherent weaknesses, even in that domain. Our dividing issues and value conflicts, and they are aggravated by the means we tend to use to solve problems. Oftentimes by exposure and confrontation and competition. So there's little inherent drive towards cooperation, and that also means that we are all pretty comfortable in operating within the walls of our silos, even in the sort of the technological or cybersecurity sense. And we often lack the practical appreciation for the level of connectedness we all have with everyone else. So, what I guess I would like to say is that these patterns tend to concentrate around elections because of their significance, because of their concrete rallying point in time. But I think we should not view and work to address them as attacks against elections, but rather as attacks against the society's way of life and our values and our coherence. And that in turn implies that election cybersecurity must be planned as and executed as an integrated whole, together with defending the overall digital ecosystem. So in addition to securing the ballots and tallying systems, comprehensive elections risk management also means that we consider the risks in auxiliary systems that might impact elections. So what are the critical dependencies on other digital systems? And where do the threats lie against our critical infrastructure? So communication services, electricity supply, digital identity used for not just voting as we do in Estonia, but also vote tallying, for example. And how could a continuity or integrity incident in these systems, in these auxiliary systems, impact the process and the perceived legitimacy of the elections process? And how are the risks managed, and these risks in particular, and who's responsible for that? So on the one hand, critical infrastructure cybersecurity is vital for assuring the security of the elections process. But it's also important because it gives assurance of the reliability of the digital environment and that conditions the normalcy for us as a society, also during the campaign period, not just the sort of the voting days. So in the EU, we have the NIS directive, the Network and Information System Security Directive, and it's enforced its last May, and I would say it's quite a significant achievement and rather strong tool in two regards. First, it creates a consistent understanding across EU what functions and services we consider as essential for our societies. But it also creates a mandatory and regular risk assessment and management mechanism so that we ideally can be adequately aware of our digital reliance of the vulnerabilities as well as threats to our most critical functions. But in that vein, I believe we shouldn't be dogmatic about the NIS or the mandatory mechanisms, especially in the context of democratic processes. Critical infrastructure is not black and white. There are varied layers of criticality, for example, due to cross-sector dependencies or cross-service dependencies. And for another, there are services and infrastructures going beyond formally designated critical infrastructure that can significantly affect public functions and public trust. So think media, for example, even social media, or think political parties and the NGOs. They may not be subject to specific cybersecurity obligations, but extending assistance to them often means a significant leap in in bringing them up to speed in understanding and managing not just their cyber risks, but by proxy also building societal resilience to cyber threats. And yes, of course, this does require resources as well. And then, if I may, I've taken up quite a bit of time, but I think one layer that cannot be ignored in this picture is if we think about the ecosystem-wide cyber risk management, it also has to do with digital literacy of political parties and the candidates and the electorate. And I am fairly keen to stress this is not just about cyber hygiene, but more fundamentally an issue of literacy, because cyber hygiene practices or following them, it may amount to, well, about 4/5 of cybersecurity, but cyber hygiene rules will not stick if their purpose and nature, the why and how things work, are not understood at the fundamental level. And that's something we need to work on when we talk about cybersecurity of the society and at large, and elections in particular as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kadri. I want to, stay on this topic on the vulnerability side, right? Because we've talked about how often malicious actors use the very same freedoms that we have and that we enjoy in order to exploit and divide us. We've talked about how the Kremlin sees any move from the West as an attack on them, and kind of mobilizes all of the tools that they have to counter. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, okay, so if we're thinking about they're exploiting our freedom of expression and our freedom of speech, they're getting in there. Our solution, presumably, it's to also how to explain this in a way that makes sense. If our democracy fails, authoritarians succeed. Right? If freedom of expression is what's being exploited, and our response is to limit freedom of expression, to really exhaust that, right? To react on that, then authoritarian regimes succeed. So when we're talking about solutions, can we think a bit through what are some democratic things that we can employ now to address some of the challenges that we've addressed in this session? Ambassador Fried.
I think I'll start with two basic principles. In attacking any public policy problem, first, unpack the problem. Don't look at the problem as a whole, because all problems looked at in the aggregate appear to be impossible. And you'll run screaming from the room because it all looks hopeless. If we start looking at the disinformation challenge as a challenge of the existential nature of truth, we're going to go down a rabbit hole and never be able to solve it. So unpack the problem into smaller, digestible bits. Secondly, second principle, work within our democratic norms. Don't become them in order to fight them. The United States learned that lesson the hard way during the Cold War. Our biggest screw-ups as the United States of America came from ignoring our own best principles and starting to imitate the enemy in tactics. Bad idea, doesn't work. When we were true to our own principles, we succeeded the most. All right, basic stuff. How does that apply to the issue of, how do those two apply? Unpack the problem, stay true to your principles, apply to the challenges of disinformation. First, separate domestic and foreign. The Russians exploit our divisions within our societies, and of course so do domestic actors. But our field of maneuver and public policy solutions are more applicable to foreign actors. Okay, there are things we can and should do to limit foreign penetration of foreign occult, hidden penetration of digital space, then we should apply to our own domestic actors. What do I mean by that? Content controls really don't have much of a place, in my opinion, fighting disinformation. I know that in fighting, that there are controls against pornography or against ISIS beheading videos. I understand that, but that is not terribly applicable against, say, Russian disinformation ops. If you go down the road of content controls, you force a government agency to be the arbiters of truth. I don't know about Spain, but I would not like, and it is not in the American tradition, to trust any administration in the United States with the role of being the arbiter of truth. Don't go there. So use principles of transparency and integrity to filter out foreign disinformation. By transparency and integrity, I mean forcing, for example, disclosure of foreign bots disguised as human beings. Use technical means to expose deep fakes, fake people, like the one Alexander created for us. That probably is in the realm of technology, if imperfect. If Juan from Madrid or Barcelona is not actually Juan And he isn't actually from Barcelona. He's Ivan from the St. Petersburg troll farm that the Kremlin funds. People ought to know that. There ought to be a ban on impersonator accounts. And frankly, that is well within the technical capability of most social media companies even today. Algorithmic bias is another area that we ought to look at. Algorithmic bias drives sensational and extremist coverage because it pays. Alexander talked about this earlier. Extremist coverage is what we go for when our emotional brain kicks in at the expense of our rational brain. Well, in the United States, in the television era, there was a so-called fairness doctrine that the major national television networks had to approximate covering both sides of the issue. Does that precedent allow us, us being the United States and the European Union, to impose or require a fairness doctrine for social media companies' algorithms? Now, I don't have an answer to this, but it is at least worthy of exploring. Whether or not we can limit the deliberate polarization as part of the social media company business model exploited by the Russians and the Chinese through regulation. Now, there are also seemingly boring technical fixes like standard terms of service among social media companies. That sounds boring and fine print technical, but it isn't, because until there is a common definition of a bot or a standard of inauthentic accounts, social media companies can simply not work together. When there is a common standard, they may be forced under common regulation to pull certain bots or certain impersonator accounts that meet a certain definition from the internet. Now, I've deliberately gone small bore and technical because my point is the technical solutions actually exist. That we, the European Union, Europe and the United States, need to get beyond the existential dread in the face of this crisis and start focusing on the solutions. And I will admit immediately that no set of solutions will solve the disinformation problem, period. But it may limit it, which is where I go to Ana Palacio. I'm going to finish up with Ana Palacio's point. You have supply, you have demand. You whack at supply, hoping to get some control over it. You will never reduce it to zero, but you may reduce it significantly. The demand side is, of course, the increase of media literacy and social media literacy, and I refuse to believe that human beings are now much stupider than we were in the 19th century. We may not be smarter, but we are probably not actually stupider. We did learn to discriminate among daily newspapers, quality journalists, yellow journalists. It took a generation. We managed it. We can do so again. Our policy problem is to control the supply as much as possible while managing to increase the discrimination of demand. And since I spent my whole career in public policy, I'm real good with imperfect solutions because those are the only kind you ever get, okay? Except during political campaigns when politicians promise to solve everything. In the real world, partial solutions that are good enough is as good as it gets, and that actually probably is enough. Anyway, more on that, but the United States has spent the last 2 years admiring the problem and pulling its hair out about the problem enough. We have the tools to solve it. And by the way, a shout out to the European Commission. They have at least taken a stab at solving it through the code of practice, the action plan, the rapid response mechanism that's being put in place before the elections. Critics say it's full of holes, it's weak, it's soft, but the Europeans are doing something about it, and I want to give them full credit. We, the United States, ought to be working with them and up our game.
Thank you, Ambassador, for you. Yeah. David, you're ready.
Yeah, Ambassador, I cannot imagine how a company that knows what I want before I know it and shows the advertisement in my screen and in my phone doesn't have the technical solution to actually tackle some bots. So I completely agree with you, you know, like what works in the advertisement field should work also in the ethics field. But when we talk about the Ministry of the Truth, and I have to disagree a little bit, Ambassador, I do not think that the European Commission has done enough. I think they could have done more. They rely on, you know, educational programs and self-regulation. Yeah, go ask RT and Sputnik to self-regulate and you'll see what happens. You know, they rely on some measures that I think are not enough. If we do nothing, I mean, if we do nothing because we think we're going to run the risk of being a Ministry of Truth, policy-wise, then, like, of course, I have some examples here that I noted down, like, fast, like, we will believe that that famous flight that dropped in Ukraine was shot down because, you know, like, the people who were going to cure AIDS were flying there and some pharmaceutical company shut it down, as opposed to a Russian missile, you know, and that's what the Russian media are reporting. We would believe that the responsible people for, like, poisoning Skripal would be Donald Trump and Theresa May, or maybe a Spanish company that had interest in, like, spreading some type of virus, or maybe it was an overdose. This has been published. We would think that the war in Afghanistan started because the United States was looking for some type of gas or, like, some mineral that was, like, there, like, that never materialized. This is published today by the Russian media. We would believe that George Soros is behind absolutely anything that happens in the world, from, like, far left to far right to independence to nationalist sentiment. So something needs to be done. And as a journalist, I refuse to believe that propaganda agents have to be treated as I have to be treated. You know, I go through some checks before I enter any press conference. You know, I have to take exams to enter, like, my studies. You know, I had to, like, do research. I'm held to some standards, and they are not. Whenever I make a mistake, I have to write a correction. They don't. They are offered these platforms in order to spread this misinformation, and they are not held accountable as we are. I've seen headlines by RT and Sputnik in election time changing. And nobody said anything. Tanks in the streets of Barcelona. And then, like, oh, someone said that he saw a tank. 1,000 people injured. Well, actually, like, it was not injured. Like, they were just treated. Like, this happens every day. I've seen some things that actually work. And one of them has been done in the United States. When you force these people to register as foreign agents, they actually suffer a lot. And they make a lot of noise. They make a lot of noise. And when you see YouTube, and it says, like, RT is a company that is funded by the Russian government, they make a lot of noise there. I remember I mean, we're talking about election coverage. There are two experiences that I think were very enlightening recently. One, in the elections in France, I don't know if you remember, there's a gag, you know, like today, I think it's 48 hours in France, where you cannot publish interviews, polls, whatever. This happens in Europe for reasons that escape me nowadays because, you know, like, you can actually bypass this through social media. But do you guys remember AM leaks, Emmanuel Macron leaks? During the gag time, like, they accused Macron of doing drugs, having a lover, like 1 million things, and they were all fake. But they were there, and the media could not do anything. Then Macron, what did Macron do? These guys are not coming into my press conferences because they are not journalists. And he said that next to Putin. And said, like, when they behave like journalists, they can come. The second thing that I think works in election time is what Theresa May did during the Skripal poisoning crisis. You know, as she was receiving the information, she created a crisis, like a war room, and they were releasing the information in real time as they were getting it. So you saw the photos of these people. You saw when they came from St. Petersburg, who they were, what hotel they stayed in, what their names were, what their passport was. And, you know, the media and the people were getting the information to counter I mean, I counted 20 different versions from Russian media on who poisoned Skripal. From like overdose to he was not poisoned, he didn't exist.
His mother-in-law.
Yeah. His mother-in-law.
His mother-in-law, obviously, right? Yeah.
So, and just to summarize, like, I think there is something that is really good for fighting disinformation. And you may agree with him or not, you may be for Trump or against Trump, but the Mueller report on the Internet Research Agency is a damning indictment on what Russia has been doing for the past year. And devoting the resources to actually analyze this, research this, and actually see it, you know, I think that has done for the fight against disinformation more than anything that the European Commission has done. But I'm European and I have to criticize the European Union. It's like something that we do here.